The coffee in her thermos had still been warm then, 6 hours before the council chamber went dark. Petra had been checking figures. That was all. Fiscal Cycle 2847, Infrastructure Audit, Earth Embassy Filing. The kind of document that passed through the Infrastructure Oversight Office on Brenthic Prime 300 times a standard day without anyone reading past the summary header. She was 6 months into her provisional liaison posting, still learning which supervisors needed hard copies and which accepted data link transfers. Still learning which corners of the office collected dust and which ones held the real decisions. Still learning the difference between the Brenthic concept of routine, a word that implied proper order, hierarchy respected, processes followed, and the human concept of routine, which meant something closer to survival disguised as boredom. The thermos sat beside her workstation, a gift from her daughter back on Earth. The ceramic was chipped where Petra had dropped it during her second week, still not used to Brenthic gravity. The liquid inside tasted of recycled water and synthetic beans, which meant it tasted like every other cup she'd consumed since arriving. It tasted, she had realized after 3 months, like the air in the station's maintenance corridors, functional, preserved, designed to sustain life without reminding anyone that life required sustaining. She had been comparing transit hub maintenance schedules across 17 species when the first alert appeared. Not an alert, exactly. A flicker. The holographic display above her desk stuttered, refreshed, then displayed a number that made her stylus stop moving. 847,236. Human design systems detected across council space. The audit she had submitted, the one she had checked 3 times for arithmetic errors, had triggered something in the central registry. The number was supposed to be confidential. The number was supposed to be small. The number was supposed to be buried in a subcategory where no one would think to look, where human infrastructure would appear as a footnote to larger species contributions, where Earth's role in galactic development could remain politely unacknowledged. It wasn't small. Petra set the thermos down. The ceramic clicked against her desk, a sound she would remember later when she tried to locate the exact moment everything had shifted. The sound of routine ending. The sound of something else beginning, though she could not yet name it. She had time to send one message to Sol System Infrastructure Control, a brief query about protocol for registry anomalies. The response came faster than light speed should allow, suggesting that someone on Earth had been waiting for this question, had prepared for it, had perhaps been waiting for decades or centuries for someone to finally ask. Then the emergency summons arrived from the Galactic Council chamber, and she was running through corridors she barely knew, clutching a data chip she hadn't authorized, toward a meeting she hadn't been trained to attend. The corridors of the Infrastructure Oversight Office were designed for efficiency, not drama. Petra passed colleagues who did not look up from their workstations, who had not received emergency summons, whose days remained routine in the way she had believed her day would remain routine. She passed a maintenance technician adjusting a ventilation grate, the kind of work that happened constantly invisibly, the kind of work that kept everyone breathing without anyone remembering that breathing required maintenance. She thought of her daughter's message from that morning. A question about the Harvest Festival. A question about whether Petra would be home. A question that assumed the provisional posting would end as provisional postings were supposed to end, that the 6-month assignment would conclude with a return ticket and a resumption of the life that had existed before. Petra had not answered yet. She had been checking figures. That was all. The council chamber was full when she arrived. 300 species represented in curved observation tiers, the architecture designed so that every delegate could see every other delegate while simultaneously being watched by all of them. The design was Brenthic, originally, though Petra could see human engineering in the structural supports, in the load distribution, in the redundancy of the life support systems that maintained the atmosphere for 300 different respiratory requirements. She could see it now. She had not been trained to see it before. Senator Bale stood at the central podium, his brenthic features arranged in the expression Petra had learned to read as controlled fury. The ridges above his eyes were flattened, a sign of stress she had observed in other brenthic supervisors when projects exceeded timeline or budget. The set of his shoulders suggested he had been standing for some time, delivering a presentation that had not gone as planned. He was speaking about sanctions. Economic isolation for Earth. The infrastructure audit had revealed, he said, systematic infiltration of critical systems. The word infiltration carried specific weight in council proceedings, implying intentionality, implying hostility, implying a threat that required collective response. Petra heard the word and understood that it was wrong. Not the systems themselves. The systems were real. But the story attached to them was wrong, and the story was everything. She found her designated station near the rear of the human delegation section. A senior analyst named Corbin shot her a look that asked who she was and why she was here. She didn't have an answer. She was provisional. She was unnecessary. She was holding a data chip containing 847,236 instances of human engineering embedded in systems no human had officially touched for 2,000 years. The number rotated on her personal display, 847,236, and she understood that it was incomplete. The registry search had been limited to active systems with clear attribution chains. It had not included the legacy systems, the ones that had been running so long that their origins had been forgotten, the ones that had become invisible through sheer persistence. Bale finished his statement. The chamber filled with the murmur of translation devices converting his brenthic syntax into 300 languages, the mechanical chorus of meaning being made portable across species boundaries. Petra watched the number rotate and thought about the maintenance logs she had reviewed during her 6 months, the records that tracked repairs and replacements and updates across systems that predated her birth by millennia. The logs that showed continuous human oversight, human intervention, human presence in the infrastructure of species that had forgotten humans had ever been present. She raised her hand. It was not the correct protocol. Junior liaisons did not interrupt council sessions. Junior liaisons did not contradict senior senators from founding species. But Petra had spent 23 years learning to read infrastructure, 6 months of them here, and infrastructure did not lie. Systems either functioned or they failed. The number was correct. The story attached to it was not. Provisional liaison Petra, the session moderator said, her tone suggesting she had already decided this would not be worth the interruption. The moderator was Keth, Petra thought, or perhaps Veshtari. She had not learned to distinguish the subtle variations in cranial structure that her colleagues discussed during breaks. You have a correction. Petra stood. Her knees felt loose, the way they had felt when she first arrived on Brenthic Prime and hadn't yet adjusted to the heavier gravity. The way they felt when she received messages from her daughter and did not know how to respond. She held the data chip in her left hand, the chipped thermos in her right, though she didn't remember retrieving it from her desk, didn't remember deciding to bring it, didn't understand why she was holding an empty coffee container in the most important room in the galaxy. The figure requires updating, she said. Her voice carried farther than she expected in the chamber's acoustic design, the human-engineered acoustic design, she realized now, the design that ensured every voice could be heard regardless of species' vocal range. The preliminary audit showed 847,236 human-designed systems. The corrected figure is 1.2 million. Silence. Not complete silence. Petra could hear the ventilation systems, the hum of translation devices, the shifting weight of 300 delegates adjusting in their seats. The sounds of infrastructure functioning, the sounds of systems that did not care about drama or revelation or the correct protocol for interrupting council sessions. The sounds of systems that simply continued, as they had continued for 2,000 years, as they would continue after this moment was forgotten. But no one spoke. No one asked the obvious question, the one she had asked herself 6 hours ago when she first saw the expanded registry search results. No one asked how. No one asked why. The silence contained both questions, contained all questions, contained the weight of 1.2 million systems that had been built and maintained and forgotten. Bale broke it. Explain. Which meant the redundancy protocols had triggered in 17 systems simultaneously. Petra had not known this would happen. She had known the systems were connected, had known that human engineering from 2 millennia past had been thorough, had been obsessive, had been built by a species that had learned to engineer for failure modes they could not imagine. She had known that the registry entries were linked through maintenance protocols that updated across networks automatically, that the routine audit she had submitted had triggered verification sequences in systems she had not known were watching. She had not known that demonstrating the connection would cause a cascade. 17 systems across 12 species failed at once. Not catastrophically. Not destructively. They simply shifted into diagnostic mode, the way human-designed infrastructure always did when it detected an anomaly requiring attention. The way Petra's workstation had flickered when she first saw the number, the way systems throughout the chamber were flickering now. Transit hubs rerouted traffic automatically. Communication arrays switched to backup frequencies. Life support systems on 3 stations began running parallel filtration cycles, redundant and unnecessary and perfectly functional. The chamber's main display, the one showing Bale's sanctions proposal, flickered. Refreshed. Showed a diagnostic readout in a format Petra recognized from her earliest training, a layout that predated the Council itself by 800 years. Those are human error codes, someone said. A delegate from the tier above Petra, species she didn't recognize, voice carrying the particular tone of someone seeing something they had not expected to see. My station uses that same diagnostic structure. Has for 3 centuries. Petra watched Bale's face. She watched him understand that his logistics network, the one he had been praising as exclusively Brenthic designed for his entire political career, was running human code. She watched him understand that the sanctions vote he had called would require systems to tabulate results, systems to verify identities, systems to execute economic transfers. All of it. Every piece. Every function that the Council depended upon, that the galaxy depended upon, that 300 species depended upon without knowing they depended upon it. The chamber went dark. Not completely dark. Emergency lighting activated, the soft blue glow that Petra associated with human-designed systems because humans had invented it, because humans had shared it, because humans had been building infrastructure while the species currently panicking in the observation tiers were still discovering electricity. The blue was specific, a wavelength chosen because it preserved night vision while providing sufficient illumination for emergency maintenance. Petra knew this because she had read the specifications, during her training, during the 6 months of routine that had led to this moment. In the blue darkness, someone whispered a word. Petra's translation device rendered it as gods, though she suspected the original carried more nuance, more history, more fear. The word for something that had always been present but never visible. The word for infrastructure. The lights returned. The displays refreshed. The diagnostic codes cleared. 17 systems resumed normal operation, having verified their own integrity, having confirmed that no actual failure had occurred, having simply done what they were designed to do when they detected something requiring attention. Bale was no longer at the podium. He had returned to his delegate station, his features arranged differently now, something Petra couldn't read. Something that might have been recognition, or might have been calculation, or might have been the beginning of a different kind of fury than the controlled version he had displayed before. The moderator looked at Petra with an expression that suggested the interruption had become significantly more interesting than anticipated. Provisional liaison Petra, she said. You will explain the corrected figure. And you will explain the system's failure. Petra looked at her thermos. The chip in her other hand felt warm, though she knew it was not warm, knew it was simply a data container, simply storage, simply evidence of work done by people who had not expected recognition. It wasn't a failure, she said. It was a demonstration. The systems detected an anomaly, my correction to the registry count, and ran verification protocols. They're designed to do that. They're designed to keep functioning regardless of what happens around them. She paused. The chamber was listening. 300 species, and she could feel them listening the way she could feel the hum of a well-maintained reactor, the vibration of a stable orbit, the particular silence of a system that was not broken but was simply waiting for the next instruction. The 1.2 million systems, she continued. They're not infiltrations. They're not hidden. They're simply old. Earth experienced a solar catastrophe 2,847 years ago. The infrastructure that survived was built with redundancy protocols that seemed excessive at the time. When early council species requested technical assistance, humans offered what they had. The systems worked. They kept working. Everyone forgot where they came from. A delegate from the Veshtari section stood. Petra recognized the species from the registry, SP-11, the ones whose encryption standards were considered the most advanced in council space. The delegate was older than most, her features settled into patterns that suggested long experience with secrets, with systems that protected information, with the particular weight of security that had been maintained across centuries. We trusted your encryption for 400 years, the Veshtari said. Her voice carried the weight of someone admitting something she had not planned to admit, something that challenged her own understanding of her civilization's achievements. We never knew it was you. Petra felt the words land. Not as accusation. As recognition. The Veshtari had maintained their own secret, their own unacknowledged reliance, and now both secrets were visible, both dependencies exposed, neither side having known they were mirrored. The symmetry of it struck her, the way infrastructure created relationships that outlasted awareness, that outlasted memory, that outlasted the civilizations that had built them. The moderator called for a recess. Delegates moved in the observation tiers, clustering in species groups, gesturing, speaking in the urgent tones of people who had just discovered their foundations were not what they believed. Petra remained standing in the aisle, uncertain whether she had permission to return to her station, uncertain whether she had a station to return to, uncertain what provisional meant when you had just revealed the architecture of an entire civilization. Corvin approached her. The senior analyst who had questioned her presence now looked at her with an expression Petra could read: calculation, assessment, the beginning of political utility. He saw something useful in what she had done, something that could be shaped into advantage, something that had value beyond the mere fact of its revelation. You should have cleared that with oversight, he said. The words were criticism, but his tone was not. His tone was the tone of someone who had just witnessed something that changed the parameters of their work, who was adjusting to new information as quickly as possible. The systems cleared themselves, Petra replied. I just pointed to them. She would learn later that the sanctions vote failed 847-0. She would learn that 3 species formally requested human infrastructure audits, wanting to know what they had inherited without knowing. She would learn that Senator Bale's logistics network was 100% human-operated, had been for centuries, and that he would spend the remainder of his career navigating the implications of that truth. In the moment, she simply stood in the aisle, holding her thermos, waiting for someone to tell her what provisional liaisons did when they had accidentally become necessary. The answer, when it came, was unexpected. Sol System Infrastructure Control, Corvin said, has requested you personally. They want someone to walk the delegation through the original systems. Someone who understands the registry. Petra looked at the data chip in her hand. The routine audit file. The corrected figure. The evidence of 2,847 years of continuous operation, of engineers who had maintained systems they would never see, of redundancy built by people who had learned that survival meant preparing for catastrophes that might never come. "I'll need to call my daughter," she said. "To tell her I'll be late." Corvin nodded as if this were a reasonable request, as if provisional liaisons mentioned their children in council chambers every day, as if the personal and the galactic had always been allowed to touch. Perhaps they had been. Perhaps the engineers who built the systems had mentioned their children in similar moments, had paused between calculations to send messages home, had carried the weight of both the immediate and the eternal in the same hands that held coffee containers and data chips. Petra walked back through the corridors she barely knew, toward her office where the coffee in her thermos had gone cold 6 hours ago, toward the communication array where she would send a message to Earth, toward the next phase of a day that had started with routine and would end somewhere she could not yet imagine. The data chip sat in her pocket, unremarkable, containing the names of 47 engineers who had maintained galactic systems without recognition. She would read them later. All of them. She would learn that one of them had been her great-great-grandmother, though she did not know this yet. For now, she walked through corridors that hummed with human-designed ventilation, past security systems that ran human code, toward a future that had been built by people who understood that infrastructure was simply love made visible, made functional, made to outlast the hands that built it. The delegation arrived at Sol System Infrastructure Control 6 days later. Petra had spent the intervening time preparing documentation she hadn't known existed, learning systems she hadn't known she was authorized to access, and receiving 3 messages from her daughter that she had read but not answered. The last message had contained a question about whether Petra would be home for the Harvest Festival, a question that assumed Petra still had a home to return to, a question that assumed the provisional liaison posting would end as provisional postings were supposed to end. She had not answered because she did not know the answer. She had not answered because every time she composed a response, she found herself thinking about the 47 engineers, about the maintenance logs she had glimpsed in her preparation, about the names that appeared in records older than most civilizations. She found herself thinking about her mother mentioning Amara at family gatherings, the great-great-grandmother who had worked in space, whose specific contributions had been lost to time, whose existence had become family mythology rather than documented history. Petra met the delegation at the orbital transfer station. Senator Bale was not among them, his presence having been replaced by a junior attaché whose expression suggested he had drawn the short assignment, the political task that offered no advantage and significant exposure to uncomfortable truths. The Veshtari delegate attended, the same older female who had spoken in the chamber, her presence unexpected and unexplained by the official itinerary. 12 other species representatives filled the transport, each having requested the audit, each having been granted permission to observe what humanity had built, each carrying their own questions about inheritance and forgetting and the nature of systems that outlasted memory. The transport docked at Sol System Infrastructure Control. Petra led them through the station's maintenance corridors, the same corridors she had walked during her training, the same corridors that now felt different because she understood what they contained. She had expected to feel pride, or defensiveness, or the anxiety of being examined by representatives of species who had considered themselves superior until 6 days ago. Instead she felt the familiarity of systems that functioned, the comfort of redundancy made visible, the particular peace of being in a place that had been designed for endurance. Every corridor contained backup systems for the backup systems. Every junction showed 3 routes where one would have sufficed. Every maintenance panel displayed instructions in 17 languages, including languages that had not been spoken for 1,000 years, including languages that had been added speculatively in case future species might need access. The delegation moved through infrastructure that had been designed by people who had learned, 2 millennia past, that survival meant building for possibilities that statistics said would never occur. "This is the primary control node for inter-system traffic," Petra said. She gestured to a room that looked, deliberately, unremarkable. The designers had understood that important systems should not appear important, that visibility created vulnerability, that the most secure infrastructure was the infrastructure that no one noticed. Consoles arranged in rows. Workstations where technicians monitored displays that showed nothing unusual because nothing unusual was happening. The redundancy was invisible by design, the way the best infrastructure always was. The systems you're seeing are original architecture, she continued. Approximately 2,400 years of continuous operation. The consoles have been replaced, the interfaces updated, but the underlying protocols have not changed since the solar catastrophe. They haven't needed to change. They were designed to last. A delegate from the Keth species, whose registry file indicated they had received human technical assistance 9 centuries ago, leaned closer to a console. His cranial ridges, the characteristic feature that distinguished Keth from other humanoid species, contracted in a pattern Petra had learned to read as intense concentration. "This interface," he said. "My colony's irrigation controls use this same layout. The same color coding for priority alerts. The same arrangement of secondary functions. I thought it was Keth design. My great-great-grandfather designed the original system. We have celebrated his innovation for 9 centuries. It was human design shared with early Keth settlers," Petra said. She watched his face, watched him process the information, watched him navigate the space between family pride and historical accuracy. The original engineers believed good infrastructure should be intuitive enough to operate without training. They built for users they would never meet. They built for your great-great-grandfather, though they didn't know his name. They built for anyone who might need it. The Keth delegate stepped back from the console. His ridges remained contracted, but his posture had shifted, the way people shifted when they received information that would require time to integrate. "He always said the system felt like a gift," he said quietly. "He said it worked too well to have been designed by anyone he knew. We thought he was being modest." The Veshtari delegate moved to a secondary display, one showing encryption protocols. She touched the screen without activating it, her fingers tracing shapes that Petra recognized from the council chamber, the same patterns that had appeared in the diagnostic cascade that had interrupted Baal's sanctions proposal. 400 years, the Veshtari said. Not asking. Stating. Confirming what she had already admitted, what she was now seeing in its original context. We thought we were using indigenous cryptography. We thought our security was self-developed. We thought we were protecting ourselves. Petra watched her. The delegate's touch suggested something beyond professional interest, something personal, something that connected to the weight Petra had heard in her voice during the council session. Someone you knew. The Veshtari's fingers stopped moving. She did not look at Petra, kept her attention on the screen, on the encryption patterns that had protected her civilization for centuries without their knowing the source of that protection. My mentor. She designed the protocols we still use. She spent her life believing she had created something original, something that would secure our communications against any threat. She died believing that. She died proud of that achievement. A pause. The ventilation hummed, human-designed, circulating air that had been filtered through systems older than the delegate's civilization. The sound of infrastructure continuing, indifferent to the dramas of recognition and attribution. She would have wanted to know, the Veshtari continued. She would have wanted to thank them. The ones who made it possible. The ones who gave her the foundation she believed she had invented. Them. The 47 engineers. The ones whose names Petra had not yet read. The tour continued. Petra showed them the redundancy systems that had saved Earth during the solar catastrophe, the parallel networks that had maintained function while entire continents went dark, the specific engineering decisions that had prioritized survival over efficiency, that had accepted the cost of overbuilding in exchange for the certainty of function. She showed them the maintenance logs, the continuous records that tracked every component replacement, every software update, every adjustment made by hands that had long since become dust. The solar catastrophe was not predicted, Petra explained. She had read the historical files during her preparation, had absorbed the accounts of a civilization that had nearly ended, that had survived only because it had built beyond any reasonable requirement. The stellar monitoring systems of the time indicated stability. The infrastructure was built against a possibility that statistics said would never occur. When the instability finally manifested, the redundancy was already in place. The systems functioned. The civilization survived. And the engineers who had been criticized for overbuilding, for wasting resources on unnecessary backup systems, became the ones who had saved everything. She showed them the specific protocols that had been shared with early council species, the technical assistance that had been offered without condition, without claim, without any mechanism for tracking attribution. She showed them the records of engineers who had traveled to alien worlds, who had learned unfamiliar biological requirements, who had designed life support systems for species they had never encountered before and would never encounter again. They didn't ask for recognition, Petra said. They asked only that the systems function. They believed that infrastructure was a language that could be spoken across species boundaries, that the ability to maintain life was more important than the identity of the maintainer. They were building for a future they would not see. They were building for you. The delegation asked questions she could not always answer. They wanted to know why humans had shared these systems without claiming credit, why the original engineers had accepted the cost of anonymity, why a civilization would invest so much in infrastructure that would be forgotten. They wanted to know why humanity had maintained galactic infrastructure for 2 millennia without requesting recognition, without asserting ownership, without using the dependency they had created as leverage for political advantage. Petra considered the questions as she led them through corridors that hummed with ancient function. The answers were not in the technical documentation. The answers were in the maintenance logs, in the personal notations that engineers had added to official records, in the spaces where professional duty became something else, something that resembled care. "Come," she said. She had not planned this part of the tour. It was not on the authorized route, not included in the itinerary that Corbin had approved, not part of the official presentation that had been prepared for the delegation. "There's something you should see." She took them to the secondary archive, the one that stored personnel records rather than technical specifications. The room was smaller than the control nodes, climate-controlled for preservation, lit with the soft illumination that original human designers had preferred for spaces where people needed to read carefully, where the information was not urgent but was important, where the past was kept accessible because the past mattered. The data chip in her pocket felt warm again, though she knew it was not warm, knew it was simply a data container, simply storage, simply a piece of technology that held information without feeling about what that information meant. Petra accessed the terminal. The interface was ancient, the same layout that appeared in 17 species systems across council space, the same design philosophy that assumed users should understand without training, that good design was invisible design. She entered the query she had prepared during the 6 days of waiting, the search parameters that would locate the 47 engineers who had maintained galactic systems without recognition. The display filled with names. 47 entries, each containing identification codes, assignment records, maintenance schedules, and personal notations that had been preserved for 2 millennia. 47 people who had worked and died and been remembered only in logs that no one had thought to read. Petra read the first name aloud. Yuki Tanaka Okafor. Solar Array Maintenance, Outer Rim Stations. Service period, 847 years. Personal notation, the Keth irrigation project is showing stress fractures in the secondary couplings. Recommend reinforcement before monsoon season. The settlers don't know to check for this. Someone should tell them. Not for credit. Just so the system keeps working. She read the second name. Marcus Chin Williams. Encryption Protocol Oversight. Service period, 1203 years. Personal notation: the Veshtari delegation requested enhanced security for their diplomatic channels. Provided standard implementation. Their gratitude was unnecessary but appreciated. The important thing is that they feel secure. The important thing is function. The delegation stood in silence. The Veshtari delegate's eyes were closed, though Petra could not tell if this was grief or recognition or something that contained both, something that was still being formed in the space between what she had believed and what she was learning. Petra continued. She read all the names she had time to read before the delegation's schedule required them to return to their transport. She read about engineers who had noticed problems in systems they were not assigned to maintain, who had provided solutions to species who did not know to ask, who had built redundancy into infrastructure that would outlast their own lives by thousands of years. She read about people who had worked without expectation of recognition, who had maintained the work of predecessors they had never met, who had prepared the foundation for successors they would never know. She read the 23rd name. Amara Osei Petrov. Deep Space Relay Maintenance. Service period, 1,567 years. Personal notation: the Brenthic logistics network is running hot in the tertiary nodes. They haven't noticed yet. Left diagnostic flags that will trigger before failure. Hope someone checks the logs. Hope someone remembers to check the logs. The systems will remind them if they forget. The systems always remind them. Amara. The name Petra's mother had mentioned at family gatherings, the great-great-grandmother who had worked in space, who had been mentioned in the same breath as other ancestors whose specific contributions had been lost to time. Petra had not known she was here, in this archive, in this list of 47. She had not known that the family mythology was documented fact, that the ancestor who worked in space had worked in this specific way, had maintained these specific systems, had left these specific notations about hope and memory and the function of infrastructure that outlasted individual lives. She finished reading the names she had time to read. The delegation departed in silence, each representative carrying data they had not expected to receive, each processing the weight of inheritance they had not known they possessed. The Keth delegate paused at the door, looked back at the terminal where his great-great-grandfather's irrigation system had been designed, nodded once in a gesture Petra interpreted as acknowledgement, and left. Petra remained in the archive. The terminal still displayed the list, the 47 names, the personal notations that transformed technical records into something that resembled love, into something that resembled the way parents maintained homes for children who would not appreciate the maintenance until they became parents themselves. She copied the data to her chip, the same chip that had contained the routine audit file, the corrected figure, the evidence that had started everything. The chip now contained two types of information. The registry count, 1.2 million systems. The personnel record, 47 engineers who had maintained them. The metadata still contained her daughter's reminder, the call after work note that had been attached to the original file by accident or by the unconscious habit of a mother working far from home, a note that had survived through the cascade of revelations because it was embedded in the file structure itself, because the systems preserved everything, because redundancy meant that even accidental data persisted. Petra returned to her temporary quarters at the infrastructure control station. She sat with the chip and a communication terminal and composed a message she did not send. The message explained to her daughter that the harvest festival would happen without her, that the provisional posting had become something else, that the routine audit had revealed a family history that changed what Petra understood about her own name, about her own work, about her own relationship to systems that outlasted memory. She did not send it. Instead she called, voice only, the way her daughter preferred, the way that preserved the intimacy of distance while bridging it. "You're late," her daughter said. The connection carried the sound of wind through earth vegetation, the atmospheric conditions that Petra had not experienced for 6 months, the specific quality of air that moved through living systems rather than recycled through mechanical ones. "I found something," Petra said. About your great-great-grandmother. She maintained the systems that kept the Brenthic logistics network running. She left notes hoping someone would check the logs. She left notes about hope. She left notes about remembering. A pause. The wind continued. Petra imagined her daughter standing in the garden they had planted together, the one that would need harvesting whether Petra returned or not, the one that had continued growing through 6 months of absence because systems continued, because life continued, because the work of maintenance continued regardless of who was present to perform it. Are you coming home? The question contained multiple questions. Petra heard them all. She heard the request for presence, the fear of abandonment, the uncertainty about whether infrastructure could be more important than family, whether the 47 names could matter more than one daughter waiting for a call, whether the work of maintaining systems could justify the absence from the systems of relationship that also required maintenance. I don't know, Petra said. The honesty felt like the only possible answer, the only answer that respected both the question and the complexity it contained. The systems need maintenance. They always need maintenance. Someone has to check the logs. Someone has to remember to check the logs. Another pause. Longer. The wind stopped, or the connection filtered it out, or Petra simply stopped hearing it because she was listening to something else, listening to the space between words where meaning accumulated. Check the logs, her daughter said. Then call me again. The connection ended. Petra sat with the chip in her hand, the 47 names in her memory, the weight of 2,847 years of continuous operation pressing against her chest in a way that felt like responsibility and like grief and like something that might eventually become pride. She sat with the understanding that her daughter had given her permission to continue, had recognized the work as necessary, had acknowledged that some maintenance required presence and some required distance and both forms were expressions of care. She closed the file on her terminal. The display went dark, then refreshed with the standard interface, the ancient design that 17 species still used without knowing its origin, the design that would continue to function after this moment was forgotten, after Petra's name was added to some future list of maintainers, after the specific details of revelation and recognition had been lost to the continuity that infrastructure provided. Petra opened it again. She scrolled to the personnel records. She read the names she had not had time to read aloud to the delegation. All of them. The ones who had maintained systems without recognition, who had built redundancy for catastrophes they would not survive, who had trusted that someone, eventually, would check the logs, would remember to check the logs, would continue the work that had no natural ending because infrastructure was simply the form that care took when extended across time and species and the vast distances between stars. She read until the station's artificial night cycle dimmed the lights, until her eyes ached with the strain of ancient display technology, until the chip in her hand had warmed to her body temperature and lost its distinction from her own skin, until the names became not individual identities but a continuous presence, a chorus of maintainers who had spoken through time in the language of function and redundancy and hope. The analyst closed the file. Then opened it again and read the names. All of them.